ISIS is already here. We are in your PCs. In each military base, the hijacked Central Command account reads, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, the Cyber Caliphate continues its cyber jihad." The posts continue. But is this group, the Cyber Caliphate, really ISIS?
There is a lot of cyber in that CNN news clip. And the reason I show that is because there is a lot of drama in that news clip, as is most things with CNN. What I'm going to be talking about today is a case study that I've been looking at for roughly the past 2 years, looking primarily at what most people, including CNN, call cyberterrorism. I did this case study because, like many of you, I saw this news article, and I thought to myself, is this something that is really a concern? Is this something that is really a problem? And I asked myself this, and I went out and started to do this. Part of this research is going to talk about the technical capabilities behind common terrorist groups that we have all known and heard about. And it also talks about other pieces of those terrorist groups, meaning it talks about their capabilities in fundraising. I talk about capabilities in how they go out, ascertain weapons, how they trade weapons, how they funnel information to each other, etc. And that's the goal of what I'm going to be talking about today. I don't like to spend a lot of time talking about myself, but in case no one has heard of me, my name is Kyle Wilhoit. I'm a senior researcher at Domain Tools, part of the Black Hat Review Board, and I have 3 primary areas of expertise that I'll traditionally focus on. One is intelligence. I come from the United States government intelligence community, and I slowly have worked over into the private sector. Also, SCADA or ICS, industrial control systems, operational technology environments, etc. And then just malware in general, traditionally just reverse engineering malware and looking at the infrastructure behind that. And then recently, I was a co-author on the Hacking Exposed ICS SCADA book. I don't include the title because it's extraordinarily long, and I don't even honestly know the full title. One thing I like to kind of start off with is, what's the difference between cyberterrorism and hacktivism? Oftentimes, when I'm having these conversations with individuals, they truly don't understand the difference. What I've come up with here is kind of the combination of what the differences are. From a cyberterrorism perspective, ultimately what it comes down to is, are the individuals attempting to perform attacks, are they wanting to result in violence in some sort? And it could be violence against non-combatant targets, such as civilians. It could be subnational groups. It could be intelligent agents. It could be many different individuals, but ultimately their objective is resulting in violence. Versus hacktivism, which is obviously a little bit different. From a hacktivist standpoint, and I'm grouping these in broad general terms, so granted there is some wiggle room here, but from a hacktivist standpoint, those individuals are interested in breaking into a system or a network primarily for political or social reasons. Their primary objective may not be causing violence. It may not be causing any type of civilian casualties, right? That might be an unintended consequence, for instance, if they were to attack a SCADA environment, but that's not their primary motivation. Again, I'm including this slide because I want to distinguish between the two. And you'll see why as we go on. I also like to talk about the history of cyberterrorism. And when I do that, I'm talking about several different groups. In one case, there's a group called the Gaza Hawkers. And these particular individuals are primarily aligned in multiple different avenues, but it's not traditionally ISIL or ISIS, what we've all heard about on the news, etc. This particular group doesn't really cause physical violence. They will funnel weapons, they will funnel arms, etc., to other groups operating within Palestine and a few other locations. But their primary motivation, they're not the ones going out and truly causing the attacks. They're defacing, they're doing more script kiddie kind of actions. There's the Muslim Hacker League, These individuals, again, aren't really in the realm of cyber terrorism. These individuals are more in between cyber terrorists and hacktivists. At the end of the day, if what they break into causes violence or causes death, they're kind of, meh, okay, that's great. Whereas that's not their primary motivation. These individuals are, again, doing defacements, compromising databases, very simplistic styles of attacks. Anonymous Ghost Gaza, another group. They kind of sit in between hacktivists as well as cyber terrorist groups. Same kind of attacks, defacements, etc. This is their Facebook page, and as we're going to go through this particular talk, you're going to notice that Facebook plays a fairly major role in this. Now I'm going to jump over into what most of us are likely familiar with, which is ISIS, ISIL, whatever you prefer to call them, whatever government group prefers to call them, that's what we're going to be discussing. I talk about this particular group in this talk, primarily because this is the most prolific, and ISIS is the group that has primarily showed a new way of monetizing, a new way of transmitting information to other groups, to other terrorist organizations, to try to further their physical violent goals. From a historical standpoint, the Caliphate cyber army was part of the ISIS group, quote unquote. And in this case, this group had gone out, compromised multiple environments, including the US Air Force. They had compromised a database in the US Air Force and had published that publicly. Some of you may have heard of that, and I'll cover that towards the end of the talk. And in this case, what they were trying to do is it was essentially a hit list. These groups, including the Caliphate cyber army, publish hit lists quite regularly, and they've actually gone out and, without any real success, they still do it quite regularly. The Islamic State Hacking Division. This particular group is part of ISIS, still to this day, and this group also is responsible for attacking US and UK military bases from a digital standpoint, not physical. And in 2015, the US government had actually charged an individual from Kosovo that was part of this group. And this particular individual was going out and distributing ISIS information, distributing several different items of newsworthy material, as well as funneling weapons, arms, and also pulling in monetary amounts through Bitcoin and through other avenues. We'll talk about that. The Islamic Cyber Army. This particular group will often go after, again, US, UK, and in this case as well, the Canadian government. These particular individuals haven't done that much as of late, primarily because, and I'll show this in a few minutes, all of these forces have combined into one central group, and I'll show that in just a minute. These particular individuals, however, have showed a particular interest in cyber attacking two different styles of environments, one being airports, and two being nuclear power. These individuals have shown a distinct interest in both of those environments, and they've also showed a unique interest in SCADA or operational technology environments as well. So they're taking a little bit different viewpoint and looking at it a little bit more in depth. The Sun's Caliphate Army, another offshoot group. This group, primarily, if you might have heard, this was about 2 years ago. This particular group had targeted Mark Zuckerberg and Jack from Twitter, ultimately saying they wanted to go out and put a hit on both of those individuals. That's what made this group particularly famous. Ultimately, all of these groups, however, that I've just showed, meaning Sun's Caliphate Army and everyone else, has combined into one group called the UCC, or the United Cyber Caliphate. So right now, as we're talking about ISIS and their online presence, I'm primarily referring to UCC, the United Cyber Caliphate, which is currently a combination of all of the groups that I just discussed. So they've all combined to make one central force to then operate and go after targets, etc. They did this for targeting and trajectory purposes, meaning they were initially having issues picking out targets and putting resources behind those targets. Whenever they combined into the UCC, that allowed them the capability to more centralize their targeting mechanisms and go after targets in an easier fashion and a more correlated and a more organized fashion. From a historical standpoint, I put together a few different pieces of information, starting in roughly May of 2015, going all the way until 2017. And if we look at this, you'll see a trend as I go through some of these. But you'll notice that as groups change, meaning as maybe the Sun's Caliphate army goes down and they get wrapped up into the UCC, it typically happens right after a drone strike. So if you look, you'll see August of 2015. Some of you may have heard of Hussein, which was killed in a drone strike. And then it goes on from there, meaning every time that these groups go down, meaning that they drop or get combined into UCC, it's always subsequently followed or began with a drone strike. I'm not going to go into great detail there as to is there correlation, but that's important to understand that oftentimes these groups are reacting to kinetic activity by government agencies. Ultimately, in April of 2016, UCC becomes formed, and they are the ones that whenever it all combined, that's when it happened, in April of 2016. There are realistically 3 areas that I'm going to discuss that UCC has capabilities of. Media support being 1, fundraising being 2, and digital attacks being number 3. And I break all of these down into a Maltego graph that I try to show and have you understand that there are different groups operating within UCC, as I've mentioned. So in this case, for instance, there's 7 different groups, or subgroups, if you will, of UCC that are responsible with performing cyber attacks. And as you can see, Islamic Cyber Army is part of that, and several other groups as well. And they might be small, organized groups, or they might be rough offshoots of loosely affiliated individuals that have like interests. Additionally, media. And whenever I say media, what I'm referring to is dissemination of information, going out, posting Facebook, fundraising, these kind of things. They're part of channeling that information to the public. And again, there's several subgroups associated with the media organization of UCC. And then finally, fundraising. There's several subgroups responsible for fundraising. And you can see how UCC organized these subgroups to, again, target specific mission objectives. And in this case, fundraising, for instance, they're responsible with fundraising not just from a money perspective, but also fundraising from an arms perspective, meaning they are responsible for also ascertaining physical weapons to operate in a kinetic fashion in specific areas. So what I'm trying to show here is, while it's oftentimes thought that ISIL or ISIS runs as one group, it's oftentimes smaller subsets of groups specifically to the UCC that are operating in tandem and in a fairly organized fashion. And I'll talk about how they communicate, how they organize, etc., coming up shortly. But it's important to understand that these groups are specifically subclasses of UCC. Now I'll talk about the actual technology that's being used. I've roughly organized this into 8 categories, meaning the technology pieces that I've been studying into 8 different categories. We have everything from a news and media source, meaning what sources are they using to disseminate media and news, all the way to malware development, which is somewhat new and something that I've seen in June, actually, and I'll cover that. And then to fundraising. Recruitment is also a massive, massive undertaking, part of the media organization of UCC. Communications and messaging, which is pretty much the foundation of how UCC operates. Meaning if UCC does not have the communication and messaging abilities, they will not be able to function, because as you saw, there's small groups of like-minded individuals all working towards one objective. Social media, attack tools, which I'll talk about that in greater detail as well. From a news and media perspective, we have two different apps that are primarily used and have been used in the past, and there's several more now that are being used and developed on a daily basis. On the left side, we have something called Alamara, which was actually an Android app developed to disseminate, again, information from the news and media arm of UCC. On the right side, we have a Chrome plugin that was specifically utilized in actually pulling down news sites and news that UCC is distributing. So instead of having to go out to a website and possibly show up in governmental logs, instead, those news sources would pop up directly into your Chrome browser, and you could get the news directly embedded into your browser without having to visit any sites at all. So they're becoming quite entrepreneurial in how they operate and how they disseminate information, because they realize if they don't have the ability to disseminate this information, they will get nowhere very fast. Additionally, this is a particular magazine, a French publication at this case, and this is still being published typically every week or two, depending upon what's geopolitically happening in the world. But in this case, I took this screenshot from one of their magazines that's actually going through how to perform operational security, meaning how to protect yourself from watchful eyes of government agencies. And in this case, they go through several recommendations that many of us are familiar with, such as Tor, utilizing VPN services, how to utilize PGP, etc., trying to make that impossible or more difficult for government agencies to actually go out and compromise those communication techniques. And as you can see, this is just one screenshot from the actual magazine. Typically, these are 60 to 70 pages. And it's a combination of digital information like this, but also a combination of information talking about geopolitical issues that are happening in the world at that time, things that they're not necessarily happy with, or things that they would like to motivate individuals to help with, etc. You can also see that this has a very professional look, which is somewhat surprising. At least I thought whenever I was going through this. Additionally, there are several forums that are actually up and running as we speak right now, including this particular forum is still up and operational with no problem. This particular forum is widely available, and all you have to do is register for an account, which actually registration for this site closed about 2 weeks ago. So they actually shut down registration completely for very likely security concerns. This particular forum is used to disseminate not only, again, media information like we saw in the last publication, but also planning for kinetic attacks, meaning I've gotten into this forum and I've looked at particular posts that are being posted, and they're actually trading and talking about where to do kinetic operations. And the regions vary, but it typically resides in Iraq, Syria, etc., places that we would be familiar with seeing these groups operate. So these are just not being used for media, but also for planning kinetic attacks as well. Another trend is underground forums, and I hate using the term underground or deep dark web, etc., but nonetheless, there is a large migration of these styles of sites, these UCC sites migrating to Tor, migrating to .onion URLs. And they're doing that for obvious reasons, right? To try to hide their infrastructure, to make it impossible or more difficult for individuals to find out the real infrastructure, where they're hosting this infrastructure, etc. If you're interested in looking at any of these sites, I highly recommend a really great project called OnionScan. Has anybody heard of OnionScan? I highly recommend looking at some of these sites if you're interested in using OnionScan to find out what's hiding on these sites. I'll leave it at that. In this case, this underground forum is actually used 100% for two different reasons, and just this one. It's used in actually showing videos of live combat footage of actual ISIL fighters in theaters of battle, wherever that might be. And it's also for propaganda videos, used for recruitment purposes, etc. All told, I looked last night actually, and I have an underground scanner that's right now scanning roughly 16,000 dark web URLs. And at this point, I've noticed about 11 different underground forums that were being operated for the purposes of UCC. So not a huge amount, but still something that I've been watching a growing trajectory in. In June, it was roughly 6, so it's slowly increasing. Social media, as I mentioned, is also a massive platform. As we saw in the CNN article or the CNN video from the beginning of this presentation, the ISIS or UCC focuses on social media because it's easy. They can access social media from virtually anywhere, and they can disseminate and reach a wide audience very quickly. Granted, these accounts get shut down very quickly by Facebook, by Twitter, etc., but all they do is re-stand up another account and operate the same way. In some cases, I've actually seen some particular individuals also disseminate and publish and distribute malware-ridden PDF files via their Facebook or Twitter accounts as well, which is kind of a newer trend that I've been watching since June or July. Twitter is being used heavily, as I kind of mentioned. And again, in this case, it's used for a wide audience. And you can oftentimes notice that there's not many followers. And that's primarily because these accounts, Twitter has gotten quite good at taking these accounts down very quickly. So the followers and the group of followers is typically quite low. And in this case, this got taken down fairly quickly as well. This is just one example. Also, UCC uses encryption quite heavily. And in this case, there were 3 programs that are still being used on a daily basis, even though they're A, old, and B, insecure. All of the applications that I'm showing here are still used, but they're insecure. There are bugs that have been published, and there are several ways to circumvent the encryption algorithms and the encryption mechanisms that are built into these applications, which is great from an intelligence perspective, right? This particular item on the far left side is actually a Pigeon plugin, and it's made to encrypt private messages. This has slowly come out of favor because there are other communication platforms that UCC is favoring. But this is still used heavily, and primarily it's used in some of the subgroups that I mentioned that are not as technologically capable. Then there's Mujahideen Secrets, which is actually a file encryption program. And it's used, think of it as a file vault, something like that. It's literally used to encrypt files and distribute to other individuals, etc. And again, there are massive security flaws in that application as well. And then finally, on the right side, is message encryption. And they're doing this for literal encryption from a messaging perspective. This is from not just instant messaging, but also from an email perspective. This was long used prior to PGP because as it was for about a year, UCC was having a hard time having individuals adopt PGP. And I say that because individuals didn't understand how PGP worked, and they didn't understand public and private key cryptography. So you can start to see that the technological prowess of these individuals is not really what you would expect based on the CNN article or the CNN video from the beginning of the talk. Recruitment. This has become quite a large issue and quite a large combination of items that actually are targeting a wide range of individuals. In this case, this was an ad for an Android application that was actually a children's dictionary. And you can see that they're not really showing wholesome things like D is for duck or A is for apple. Instead, B for bullet, which is a strange, I don't know, I wouldn't show my son this, but you never know, I guess. And then this is just the screenshots of the actual Android app that I spun up and ran and looked through, and there are multiple occasions of many different things. And again, this is 100% targeting children operating in these environments. So recruitment is becoming a massive issue. Acquiring weapons, this is also another huge problem. And realistically, this is what I would say is probably, from our perspective, meaning on a day-to-day basis, this is one of the biggest and hardest problems to tackle. And I say that because there are ads all over underground forums, on Facebook, on Twitter, etc., that are distributing and selling firearms and weapons. And I can confirm that some of these ads are 100% legitimate, and are actually working quite well in some cases. You can also see that UCC has gotten good at hiding their actual weapons and arms sales. And in this case, this particular Facebook page is actually tied to a movie character, which obviously is not the case. So now UCC is starting to realize we need to hide what we're doing under the guise of other things, like a movie character, for instance. And this particular page is actually still up because Facebook hasn't recognized it as being malicious of any sort. And this, again, is just selling arms, selling weapons, etc. Additionally, there are several sites online and several applications that are heavily used. From a communications and messaging perspective, Telegram is still by far the most widely utilized application for communications. Telegram is utilized heavily because it's easy to hide and easy to create groups and or rooms, for lack of a better term, to be able to have other individuals connect to them and communicate, distribute information, etc. that way. Luckily, in many cases, these channels are not really locked down in any fashion, meaning you can go in and join these particular Telegram groups with very little fact-checking, meaning they don't really check too often, are you legitimate or not, which makes it nice, again, from an intelligence gathering standpoint. Additionally, there are two web pages that are used most prolifically with distribution of information. Justpaste.it is actually where this page is from. And this is where they literally will disseminate and put up PDF files, or they will just copy and paste and put additional links to additional pieces of information. A lot of times, I'll actually witness individuals use JustPaste.it for going out and putting in arms sales or redirecting you to other sites to purchase arms, firearms, etc. from. Additionally, you can see Web Archive is used heavily as well. Oftentimes, for the media distribution piece of UCC, they'll publish that French magazine that I showed earlier. They'll actually publish it to Web Archive and distribute it from there, which is also quite interesting. And there's been two different occasions where individuals have actually embedded malware into those PDFs, published it on web.archive, and ultimately acted as kind of a watering hole in a way. So that is happening to some degree. Additionally, there is a website called Al Bayan Radio, and this is still alive and active. This URL changes all the time because it's brought down by registrars constantly. And in this case, if you were to play this radio, it's actually UCC, ISIL, etc., and they're distributing and talking about current objectives, current activities, etc., as well as other newsworthy items, etc. But this is used to disseminate information via a radio, right? Granted, it's online, but still. It's still interesting nonetheless because this is a massive platform for distributing that information. This is a list of, from the past 2 years, of what I've noticed being the largest collection of tools that UCC is leveraging and recommending usage. Something interesting here that I've noticed as I've been going along. There's an interesting correlation between what I'm noticing from a UCC or ISIL perspective and cyber criminals. Because a lot of times, as I'm studying cyber criminals, I'm also noticing that they're using Proton Mail, Ghost Mail, Hush Mail, all of these services and all of these webmail providers, all of the messaging apps that we've all become accustomed to reading about and hearing about. It's now starting to migrate over, and UCC is starting to realize that there is some benefit to using those applications. I think they've also realized that they're leveraging and they want to leverage applications that don't necessarily have the same security flaws that we saw in some of the other applications. I think they've realized that they're not really that great at development. So they should probably leverage architecture and applications developed by other organizations that specialize in messaging, etc. So this is a high-level view of, over the past 2 years, the most widely seen tools and the most widely recommended tools by UCC. From an attack tools perspective, there are really 3 different tools that have been making a large impact over the past year, realistically. First, on this left side is what I call a homemade DDoS tool. And keep in mind, if anybody wants any of the hashes associated with any of the files that I'm going to be talking about, please reach out to me after the talk, and I'll be happy to give you those hashes. And or the files if you don't have access to VirusTotal or anything like that. But this homemade DDoS tool was, honestly, it was shit, to be honest. It was developed terribly, doesn't work very well, and you can tell that it was written by someone that really, truly doesn't understand how to perform denial of service attacks. Also, Infos Encryptor, as well as Caliphate Canon. Infos Encryptor is literally for encrypting of text blocks as well as files, and distributing that to other individuals. And then Caliphate Canon is another additional DDoS tool that's a little bit better than this homemade garbage DDoS tool. But Caliphate Canon, again, isn't that useful, and there's not, from what I've seen, the case study of individuals using the tool hasn't been that large. So there hasn't been a humongous amount of adoption of that technology. But these are 3 homemade tools, and the development of these homemade tools is continuing and only becoming more robust as the technological interest of UCC increases. From a file sharing perspective, there are several different services that UCC will use. Most of them are regional. And what I mean by regional is they're regional in the area in which they're operating. This particular site, for instance, is called gulf-up.com. This is one of the primary platforms for actual file sharing for UCC and has been for over the past year. GulfUp, nicely enough, I won't get into great detail, but luckily gulf-up.com has some issues, and you're able to see what oftentimes is being submitted. So you have a good ability to be able to gather intelligence off of that as well. But in this case, this is the #1 site that I've seen for distributing of files. Another interesting piece is Google Drive is also used heavily by these individuals. Again, from an intelligence perspective, is amazing. But GulfUp is a big one. Now, from a malware perspective, this is something that I didn't see operating or didn't see anything or any proof of malware being utilized or developed by UCC until June of this year. I got lucky because I ended up finding a post on a specific site. And in this case, the post had referenced a specific additional URL to go gain access to for files, etc. Luckily for me, they left their directories open, meaning their operational security is not good. I'll leave it at that. Luckily, on this open directory, there were several files. As you can see under Files, I, and Temp, there were several files. And in one case, there was a piece of malware that appears to be built with what's called the Ancalog exploit builder. Some of you have probably heard of that. But it appears that this particular piece of malware was actually leveraging a specific vulnerability, CVE 2016-0189, and that ultimately communicated out to a specific URL that was of interest to me because I work at domain tools, so I wanted to know what was up with that domain. And within the code, you can see, and again, if you want the hash for this, I'm happy to share that and or the file as well. And in this case, you can see that it communicates out to Isdarat. When I went out to Isdarat, what was interesting is Isdarat also had the same open directory structure. They no longer have that, but they did at the time. And luckily for me, Isdarat at that time had also published and was being leveraged by individuals posting specific files. And by files, I mean images, meaning someone would snap a photo and they would post it to Isdarat to share out with their friends, to do whatever it was. Ultimately, as it turns out, Isdarat was a very good platform for UCC to distribute pictures, meaning pictures of actual combat, pictures of weapons being fired, all sorts of things. And in this case, I pulled down one picture, and this is just a picture. I siphoned everything down and was looking at the metadata associated with those photos, et cetera. And luckily for me, a majority of the actual photos had metadata attached to it, meaning they didn't actually scrub most of their metadata. If you remember, I said that UCC's OPSEC is terrible. They are not very good at covering their tracks. Their infrastructure, when it comes to going out and looking at Isdarat, when it comes to looking at some of this other infrastructure, it is not good, meaning it's very easy to find sources. And in this case, up to 70%, roughly 70%, of the images that I had pulled off of that site had metadata embedded in it. So that was interesting. So ultimately what I was able to do was find a piece of malware that appeared to be built with an actual builder, traced it all the way back to an actual image server, for lack of a better term, which ultimately has metadata attached, which again, from an intelligence perspective, is very, very good. So now from an attacks perspective. Luckily from an attack perspective, most of the attacks are DDoS attacks. And by DDoS attacks, I mean not very good ones. Also, defacements are quite heavily utilized by UCC. And oftentimes, the defacements that they're performing is on easily compromised sites, meaning they're not doing it to large providers. They're not doing it to sites that have good web security. They're doing it to sites that typically have very little security embedded whatsoever, so it makes it an easy target. Also, the compromising of databases via traditional SQL injection, and again, not advanced SQL injection by any means, and publishing those databases as kill lists, quote unquote. And then Twitter and Facebook account compromises, and we've seen that across the board. Some of the more notable attacks was when Hobart International Airport in Australia was compromised. They defaced the web page, and this is what it was. As you can see, there's not a lot here, right? It's just a defacement, nothing too crazy. But from these types of ads, where it becomes beneficial is we have a contact email address that then I can pivot on and perform intelligence on, looking for domains, et cetera, specifically tied to that email address. So at least there is something that we can pivot on and we can take from these particular defacements and start to build out further intelligence on. US Air Force personnel leak, and in this case, these were drone operators, and this was actually published right after a drone strike had killed one of the leaders of UCC at that time. So I think they were probably a little bit angry about that, and they had gone out and actually compromised a very small database and had published, again, quote unquote, a kill list. US government personnel data leak. I blurred out all the information, but that information is accurate, so it was a true, legitimate database that they had compromised. And in this case, this is primarily talking about just any US government personnel. It could have been anyone working in the Office of Personnel Management, all the way down to there were Marine Corps colonels in that database as well. You can also see, from a timeline perspective, UCC really enjoys, and all of the Sun's Caliphate Army, Cyber Caliphate Army, all of the offshoot groups that combined into UCC, one of their favorite things is kill lists. And they do that, again, because it's easy. They can attack databases with very simple attacks, and more than likely compromise and gain very small amounts of information. So for instance, there's 36 Minnesota State police officers. The likelihood of anything really substantially happening from that is very low. And I can say from a confirmation perspective, there haven't been any actionable, at least from an intelligence perspective that I'm aware of, there haven't been any actionable deaths associated with these kill lists yet. Again, I'm saying from what I'm aware of. There may have been, but I'm not aware of that. But this also includes, in some cases, 50 federal government employees, and that included flight pilots as well, which was an interesting kind of trajectory. There's some trending that I noticed about overall architecture, overall attacks, overall technology. First, most of the forums that UCC operates are written in vBulletin. For anybody that's familiar with vBulletin, you might be familiar with the fact that it is easily exploitable, especially if they're running old versions. Just a hint. There are also few internally developed tools, and those tools that are internally developed are not very good. They've also, as we saw from this, dabbled in malware. Again, not very good, because they're just using an analog malware builder, which is basically a script kiddie. It's not advanced by any means. And also, there's really a lack of any expertise in technology from the most part, other than distributing information. What they're really, really good at is distributing information, distributing news and media to each other. And then finally, I think ultimately, from a psychological, political, and economic perspective, all of these have combined to promote the fear of cyber terrorism. I think there are obviously several things that we need to be concerned about from a cyber terrorist perspective, but as it stands from a technologically capable group, I don't view them as technologically capable at this time. However, if they were able to attract more technologically savvy users, I think then things could really get bad quick. And I'm starting to slowly see that migration again, from the migration of homemade tools to more now cyber criminal tools that they're leveraging. But also they're leveraging additional infrastructure, and they're trying out new operational security features, such as going out and using privacy proxies for domain registrations, which again, it's logical for most of us in this room to use those, but that's still something that I'm watching a migration to. That wasn't happening 2 years ago, 2 and 3 years ago. That wasn't happening that much. And ultimately, as I mentioned, I don't think, from my perspective, that cyber terrorists from UCC specifically are technologically capable, meaning they're not capable, from what I've seen, to perform a true complex attack. They're working towards that, but as it stands right now, I have not seen evidence of that capability. Ultimately, I think we should obviously be concerned. I think the biggest piece of concern from my perspective is twofold, really actually threefold. One is the dissemination of materials. That is a concerning piece because they're able to disseminate kinetic attack planning, they're able to disseminate information, news, media, etc., very accurately and very quickly, and it works very well. I think additionally, their recruitment abilities have increased and is only getting better, so that's also a massive area of concern. And then finally, their interest in operational technology environments, SCADA environments, as well as becoming more technologically capable with malware development, is becoming also concerning. So again, as it is now, I don't see this as huge, or I don't see these issues as a massive problem, but it's slowly something that I think we should watch. And this isn't just tied to UCC. This can be tied to other actor groups as well. But ultimately, what I'm trying to show with this talk is there is reason to be concerned, but ultimately it's not what the media is saying, meaning they're not currently embedded in every environment, sniffing, they're not doing that. It's just not happening. So I'm trying to cut through some of that media FUD to show what is truly happening. I appreciate everybody's time. I think we have some time for a few questions, possibly. And again,
thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to try to anticipate the response from the media. They're going to say, all right, so you're telling us that they're incapable, they're bad OPSEC, they don't know what they're doing, you know, and those are the people you find. Of course you don't find the other people that have better OPSEC, that have, you know?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. That's obviously a concern, right? I mean, if you're talking similar to like a targeted attack from a nation state level, right? We're used to reading and publishing articles about complex or non-complex nation state actors, and the ones that we do find is typically kind of luck. So of course there very well may be very complex attackers operating in these groups that maybe we just haven't seen yet. That's certainly a possibility, yeah.
Yeah, or even cells or groups that
100%.
don't show up. But that is interesting. You talk a lot about what different like social media sites, stuff like that, being used. What would you like that those social media sites did about it? I mean, they're taking stuff down. I'm not sure if that's a good idea all the time because it's also a source of intelligence, right?
Yeah, so I'm conflicted on that. And I'm conflicted because from the intelligence standpoint, I'm of the belief that keep it running and we'll monitor that. But on the other side of that, as a human, as someone that witnesses this stuff, it's also concerning because they're still having the ability to disseminate information, to recruit, etc. So it's a double-edged sword, and it's something that unfortunately you, I guess, have to weigh based on each use case. Meaning, are they actively funneling weapons and arms? If that's the case, you have to make that decision. Is that something you want to monitor or not? So unfortunately, I sit on both sides of that, and I wish there was a better answer, but ultimately I like the intel piece. I like being able to monitor and to watch that operation from a more detailed perspective.
Yeah, because you see this conversation going on, like sometimes the Twitter or Facebook will take stuff down, and everybody will like, yeah, well, they took stuff down, and sometimes they refuse to take it down, probably for because they've been told, don't leave it running, please. Right. But then you have the community, the wider community of hacktivists and stuff like that will take it down for them, or take it over for them. They go like, okay, so are we working against each other? Then that's not a good idea either, right?
Well, and the other thing is too, is social media platforms is that they'll oftentimes, it's whack-a-mole, if you know that statement, meaning one will pop up, 5 more will come up after they go down, etc. So it's a constant cat and mouse game. And it's one of those things that it's constantly being combated, but it's not going to change anytime soon, unfortunately.
But do you see that there's some like weak links in their organization? Like, okay, you can leave the stuff up and running, but if you remove this little component, they won't actually be able to spread that kind of news. But the line will be open. Yeah,
so from my perspective, I haven't seen anything, unfortunately, that would help in that perspective. And what I mean is, I haven't seen any correlation point across these accounts and how they're registering it, meaning there's no common naming convention, there's no common theme, and everyone kind of varies. So unfortunately, I haven't seen a common denominator across the board to be able to say, if we block all of this, or if we stop this one piece of functionality, then we can stop, a lot of these accounts from being created. I haven't seen that, unfortunately, and I don't know that, I haven't been able to draw a correlation across these accounts, unfortunately. The only thing that would be a possibility is being able to, if you're concerned about your own internal environments, is blocking communication protocols and blocking some of those applications that I was talking about throughout the the talk, is blocking those communications, proxies, firewalls, whatever the case is, blocking that stuff. And granted, that's only handling the internal environment that you're at, but it's still at least a step in the right direction.
Yeah, that's interesting. Questions from the audience. So the first person to ask a question this time was going to get a packed show. I said, can we get a microphone? Is there a microphone running around? No? There's no microphone running. Would you mind repeating the question after he poses it then?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, is there a way to correlate, quote-unquote, cyber activity with kinetic operations on ground, etc.? The ultimate answer is yes. I've had a lot of success doing that, and some of the most success that I've had during this 2-year study is that exact case study. And one of the examples is I was literally on Isdarat pulling down image files and running them through metadata engines and literally watching up to the second images being posted and direct locations of metadata. And these pictures weren't just of an airplane. Like, these pictures were actually individuals firing mortars, there were videos, and they were time-stamped, etc. A majority of those particular image files and video files were happening within Iraq and Syria. A majority of them were. So I've had a lot of success doing that, not just from looking at a drop server like that, but also from forums, meaning I've had a lot of success being able to see forethought and planning on kinetic activity maybe 2 weeks out in a specific region. And then obviously you can get intelligence agencies and other entities involved to look at that a little bit closer once it happens. But I've certainly had a lot of success being able to do that.
I saw another hand somewhere. No? You guys want more coffee? All right, well, one here.
How would they go about to increase their operational security?
Yeah, that's a...
Yeah, we don't talk about that.
So yeah, I hate...
to look for that.
So I don't want to go into too much detail here. But there are several ways, I mean, from one perspective that I've had a lot of success locating specific individuals is whenever they go out and they're the registrant on a domain, if they do use a privacy proxy, oftentimes when they first registered that domain, they did not. Meaning they used their true information, and I was able to correlate that to other user accounts on forums and then ultimately to physical locations. But that's one of the primary factors that I've been able to go back into historical WHOIS records and look back maybe 2 years in time and say, oh, okay, in 2015, they had registered this domain with their true address, with their true name, etc. And granted, for that, up until then, they've been using a privacy proxy, so if you go out and do a dig or WHOIS on that particular domain, you're going to see that there was a privacy proxy, but go back 2 years and there's not. So that's one of the primary pieces that I've seen, and from an infrastructure perspective, where I perform a lot of my intelligence is looking at their infrastructure for that reason, because it's easy to find lapses in that. Additionally, on the onion servers that they're running, oftentimes they'll also be running hidden services as well. And those hidden services are oftentimes not properly configured. I'll say that. And vBulletin. vBulletin is also a great, it's great. I'll say that.
Do we have another question? Come on. Down here, go there.
So, question slightly unrelated. What is your view on the jester, since we're talking about this?
So, my view on the jester. I've never been asked that question. I would say I'm conflicted on that as well. And I'm conflicted primarily because I think what the jester is doing, from defacements and taking down sites, doing that kind of thing, is really good. And I think he's performing a role that government entities aren't really doing publicly. So he's kind of putting a public face to the activity that really needs to happen, taking stuff down, that kind of thing. So I agree with what he's doing, just not maybe necessarily some of the mechanisms he goes about doing.
All right, in that case, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Kyle.
thank you.